I retired to Mexico at 65. Then my marriage became a trap parrot with a quiet thumbnail like, I trusted her, I wanted peace. This felt like love. The first morning I woke up in Mexico, the light came in sideways through the curtains. Not harsh, not dramatic, just steady, pale light, the kind that makes you aware of dust in the air and the sound of a city clearing its throat. Somewhere below my window, a man was sweeping the sidewalk. I could hear the bristles scrape concrete, slow and patient. A bus passed. Someone laughed. Life was already moving, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't behind it. I lay there longer than I needed to, listening. In Florida, mornings had become something I endured. Same coffee, same silence, same clock counting down hours I no longer filled with anything that mattered. My wife had been gone for 6 years by then. Cancer. Quick at the end, cruel the whole way through. After that, the house felt too big, then too quiet, then like a museum to a life that had already ended. My kids called. They meant well. But they were busy building lives that didn't include me in any meaningful way. Holidays became scheduled. Conversation shortened. I stopped telling them how empty the days felt because there was nothing they could do with that information. Retirement wasn't freedom, it was suspension. So when I sold the house, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. I told myself I was simplifying, downsizing, closing a chapter. But the truth was simpler than that. I didn't want to die in the same place my life had stopped. Mexico wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't beaches and margaritas and late nights. I didn't choose it because it was exotic. I chose it because it was close, affordable, familiar enough to feel manageable, but different enough to feel like movement. Warm weather, decent healthcare, a slower pace. That's what I told people. What I didn't say was that I wanted to disappear a little, just enough to breathe. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. Not trendy, not rough, just ordinary. The kind of place where people knew each other by sight, not by name. I liked that. I liked that no one asked questions. I liked that my past didn't come with me into the grocery store or the cafe. My days settled into a rhythm almost immediately. Morning coffee at the same place. A short walk through the park. Lunch from a small restaurant that made the same 3 dishes every day. An afternoon nap. Evenings on the balcony watching the sky change color while the city softened. There was comfort in the repetition. Comfort in being unnoticed. For a while, that was enough. Loneliness doesn't always announce itself the way people think. It doesn't always ache. Sometimes it just hums in the background, like a refrigerator you only notice when it stops. I didn't feel desperate. I felt unfinished. Like something was supposed to happen next and never did. That's the part people misunderstand. I wasn't hunting for love. I wasn't prowling bars or scrolling apps. I didn't feel entitled to companionship. I just felt open. I met her the same way I met everything else in Mexico, through routine. She worked near one of the places I went almost every day. At first, we barely spoke. A nod, a smile, a few polite words. Over time, those small exchanges stretched. A comment about the weather, a joke about my accent. She asked where I was from. I asked how long she'd worked there. There was nothing cinematic about it. She wasn't dressed to impress. No heavy makeup, no performative charm. She looked tired sometimes. Focused. Real. That's probably what drew me in before I even realized I was paying attention. She listened when I talked. That sounds small, but it isn't. Not when you've spent years feeling like your stories are already over, like everything you say is something you've already said before. She didn't interrupt. She didn't steer the conversation toward herself. She asked follow-up questions, remembered things, laughed in the right places without trying too hard. She was in her mid-30s, I later learned, old enough to carry responsibility, young enough to still believe life could bend if she pushed it in the right direction. She talked about her family, parents, siblings, the way people talk when obligation and love are tangled together. I recognized that tone. I started lingering longer than necessary, ordering another coffee, finding reasons to pass by. It wasn't lust. It wasn't infatuation. It was something quieter, familiar. I told myself I enjoyed the conversation. That was true. I didn't tell myself I was lonely. That was also true, just not in the way I was used to admitting. When we started spending time outside of that place, it felt like a natural extension of something already happening. Lunch turned into dinner. Dinner turned into walks. Walks turned into sitting somewhere too long, talking about nothing in particular. She asked about my wife once, gently, without curiosity that felt invasive. I told her a shortened version. She didn't rush to fill the silence after, she just sat there with it. That mattered more than I understood at the time. I noticed how easy it felt to be around her, how little effort it took to explain myself, how I didn't feel old in her presence. Not young either, just present. I also noticed how useful I felt. I helped with small things. A ride, carrying something heavy, explaining paperwork I barely understood myself, paying for meals without thinking about it. None of it felt transactional. It felt normal. It felt like what people do when they care. Being useful again does something strange to a man my age. It wakes up parts of you that have been asleep, parts that still want to contribute, to matter, to be relied on for something other than a phone call on Sunday. I liked that feeling more than I wanted to admit. When she came over for the first time, it wasn't framed as anything big. Just dinner. She cooked. Nothing fancy. Something she said her mother used to make. The apartment smelled different afterward. Warmer. Fuller. Like someone had lived there before me. I didn't think about what it meant. I didn't label it. I just noticed that when she left, the silence felt heavier than it had that morning. Looking back, I can see how gently the shift happened. No sudden declarations, no promises, just presence stacking on presence until it started to feel expected. She didn't push. That's important. She never pushed. She fit herself into the empty spaces I hadn't realized were there. At night, alone again, I would sit on the balcony and think about how calm everything felt. How this didn't feel like risk. How this didn't feel reckless. How nothing about it resembled the stories people warn you about. I wasn't ignoring red flags. There weren't any yet. What I was ignoring was something else. The way comfort can disguise momentum. The way stillness can feel like safety when it's really just a pause before the next movement. I told myself I'd found balance. Routine with warmth. Solitude with connection. A life that didn't demand too much but offered enough. That was the story I carried with me into what came next. I didn't know yet that the thing I was most grateful for, the feeling that someone had quietly stepped into my life without chaos, would be the same thing that made it so hard to see where I was headed. At that point, I still believed I was in control of the pace. I still believed this was my second chapter, unfolding slowly, sensibly, exactly the way I wanted it to. And that belief, calm, reasonable, unchallenged, was the foundation. Everything else would be built on. The first time she stayed late, neither of us said that was what was happening. She had come over with groceries tucked under her arm, apologizing for how heavy the bags were even though she carried most of the way herself. I told her to sit. I finished putting things away. She moved around my kitchen like she was borrowing it, not claiming it. Careful with the drawers, asking where things went, smiling when she found what she needed. We ate without turning on the television. That alone felt unusual. Back home, noise had filled space automatically. Here, we just talked about nothing important, about the way the city changed after dark, about how the afternoons felt longer here, about how quiet my place was. She didn't say it was lonely. She didn't need to. When it got late, she looked at her phone and hesitated in a way that felt rehearsed and spontaneous at the same time. Buses ran less often at night. It was safer to wait. She didn't want to rush. I offered the couch without thinking. She thanked me like it was a favor, not an invitation. That night, lying in my bed, I was aware of another presence in the apartment. The faint sound of someone breathing on the other side of a wall. It wasn't sexual. It wasn't romantic. It was grounding, like proof that the place could hold more than one life. The next morning, she was already awake when I came into the kitchen. Coffee was brewing. She smiled, a little embarrassed, and said she hoped that was okay. It was more than okay. From there, the pattern formed quietly. She didn't move in. She stayed over. Then she stayed over twice a week. Then it became easier for her to leave some things here than carry them back and forth. A sweater on the chair, toothbrush in the cup, shoes by the door. Each object appeared without announcement, like a test I didn't realize I was passing. I told myself this was how adult relationships worked. No drama, no declarations, just accommodation. She started managing small parts of my life without framing it as management, reminding me of errands, suggesting places to go, organizing things that I'd let slide without consequence because no one else depended on them. I didn't resist. I felt relieved. There's a particular exhaustion that comes with being solely responsible for yourself after decades of sharing decisions. It's not that you can't do it. It's that doing it alone feels heavier than it used to. She lightened that load without asking for credit. When I offered to help her with things, rides, groceries, covering the check, she didn't refuse, but she didn't ask either. She accepted the help the way people accept kindness when they're used to making do without it, with gratitude, not entitlement. That mattered to me. It reinforced the story I was already telling myself. I wasn't being used. I was being appreciated. She talked more openly about her family as time went on, not in a dramatic way, just facts layered with emotion. Parents getting older, siblings who needed help, responsibilities she couldn't step away from, no matter how tired she felt. I listened. I nodded. I understood more than I said. There's a strange comfort in being the stable point in someone else's story, especially when your own feels like it's already reached its conclusion. I began to notice how often she framed things in terms of we, even before there was a clear definition of what that meant. We should eat earlier. We'll figure it out. We'll take care of it. I didn't correct her. Correction would have felt like distance, and I didn't want distance. I wanted this, whatever this was, to keep feeling uncomplicated. Physical closeness came later, and even then it unfolded without urgency, a hand resting longer than necessary, a shoulder leaning into mine during a walk, falling asleep on the couch without planning to. When intimacy finally crossed from suggestion into reality, it didn't feel reckless, it felt overdue. I was aware of the age difference, of course. I wasn't blind. But it didn't feel like the kind of gap people warn you about. We didn't live in different worlds. We lived in the same city, walked the same streets, worried about the same basic things. I told myself that mattered more than numbers. What I didn't tell myself, what I avoided articulating, was how deeply I enjoyed being desired again. Not in a performative way. In a quiet, private way that didn't require me to prove anything. She didn't make me feel old, she made me feel considered. That distinction blurred lines I should have kept clearer. As time went on, she began to take a more active role in my health, asking if I'd eaten, reminding me to drink water, commenting on how tired I looked some days. It felt caring, maternal almost. I laughed it off at first, but part of me liked it. Liked that someone was paying attention to details I'd started to ignore. One afternoon, she brought over a small bag from a local shop. Inside were supplements, herbs, vitamins, things with labels I couldn't fully read. She explained them carefully, translating what she could. For energy, for circulation, good for men your age. I hesitated, more out of habit than suspicion. I'd never been big on supplements, but she wasn't pushy. She just said she worried about me, that she wanted me to stay strong, that life was better when your body didn't fight you all the time. I trusted that concern because it fit the person I thought I knew. I started taking them in the mornings. Nothing dramatic happened. If anything, I felt a little better at first, more awake, less stiff. She seemed pleased, and that pleased me. Around this time, my circle shrank further without me noticing. Invitations from expats went unanswered. I skipped a few gatherings because I didn't feel like explaining my relationship. Not because I was hiding it, because it felt private. She didn't tell me not to go. She just expressed relief when I stayed. I like when it's just us. I like that too. Dependence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say now you rely on me. It says let me handle that. It says I've got it. It says don't worry until worry feels unnecessary. I let her take over small administrative things. Phone calls, translations, appointments. It was easier. She was better at it. I told myself this was practical, not symbolic. But symbols don't need intention to work. By the time I realized she was the point of contact for most things in my life, it already felt awkward to reclaim that role, like insisting on cooking after someone has quietly taken over the kitchen and learned your preferences. There was affection in it. Care. Efficiency. And underneath all of that, something else I didn't want to name, relief at not having to steer. She talks sometimes about the future, not in concrete terms, more like gestures, a different apartment someday, maybe a business idea, maybe traveling to see her family together. I listened. I didn't commit. I didn't shut it down either. I told myself I had time. At night, lying beside her, I felt settled in a way I hadn't felt since before my wife died. Not excited, not overwhelmed, just accompanied. That feeling is dangerous when you mistake it for permanence. Looking back now, I can see how many decisions I deferred because nothing felt urgent. How many questions I didn't ask because asking them would have introduced friction into something that felt smooth. I wasn't naive. I was tired. Tired of thinking through every possibility. Tired of guarding against things that hadn't gone wrong yet. Tired of being alone with my own caution. So when closeness deepened and reliance crept in alongside it, I didn't push back. I leaned. I believed that because nothing had demanded sacrifice yet, nothing ever would. I believed that care and control were opposites. I believed that this kind of calm couldn't possibly lead anywhere dangerous. And by the time I realized how much of my life now flowed through her, emotionally, practically, even physically, it already felt like reversing course would require an explanation I didn't know how to give. I still thought I was choosing this. I didn't yet understand how subtly choice can turn into habit, and habit into structure, and structure into something you have to dismantle to escape. At this point, I still called it love, or something close enough not to argue with. I still believed I was being careful. just in a softer way than before. I still believe that because this didn't feel like risk, it wasn't. That belief carried me forward into the next stage, the one where closeness stopped being optional and commitment began to feel like the only reasonable way to keep the peace I'd grown attached to. The idea of marriage didn't arrive like a proposal. It arrived like a solution. We were sitting at the small table by the window, the one that caught the late afternoon sun. She'd been quiet most of the day, distracted in a way that felt heavier than usual. When I asked what was wrong, she didn't answer right away. She stared out at the street, watching people pass, then finally said she was worried. Not about us, about everything around us. Her parents were asking questions, neighbors were talking. At her age, living with a man without being married invited opinions she was tired of explaining away. She said it calmly, without accusation, without tears. Just facts, arranged carefully. She loved me, she said. She felt safe with me. But safety, where she came from, wasn't just emotional. It was visible, recognized, official. I didn't feel pressured. That's the part that's hardest to explain now. She wasn't asking for a ring. She wasn't threatening to leave. She was laying out a reality and letting me sit with it. I respected that. I'd always believed that adults should talk about things plainly. And in my mind, marriage didn't feel reckless. We were already living together. We shared routines. We shared meals. We shared a bed. Making it official felt less like a leap and more like a formal acknowledgement of something that had already happened. I told myself it would simplify things. Residency questions, social expectations, stability for both of us. Mostly, I told myself it was kind. At my age, kindness carries weight. It feels like something you should lean toward, not away from. We didn't have a big wedding, no spectacle, just paperwork, a few photos, a dinner afterward with her parents and a couple of relatives. They were polite, grateful, proud even. Her father shook my hand longer than necessary. Her mother hugged me and told me I was a good man. I believed her. After we married, something shifted. Not sharply, but perceptibly, like the air pressure changing in a room. She relaxed. Not emotionally, structurally. Plans that had been hypothetical became assumed. Conversations about the future stopped, including question marks. We'll do this. We'll take care of that. We should think about. I noticed it, but I didn't resist. Resistance felt unnecessary. Everything still felt calm. Financially, things changed too, though not all at once. Expenses increased in small, reasonable ways, helping her family more regularly, fixing things that had been postponed, upgrading items that had worn thin. None of it felt extravagant. It felt adult. I'd spent decades being careful with money. I wasn't suddenly careless. I was just flexible, willing to smooth rough edges because smoothing them felt like progress. Around this time, she became more attentive to my health, more insistent. She scheduled appointments, organized my medications, reminded me about the supplements she'd introduced earlier. When I mentioned seeing a doctor about some fatigue I'd been feeling, she waved it off gently. Doctors were expensive. Waiting lists were long. She knew people. She knew what worked. I trusted that because trust had become the foundation of everything else. I also trusted her with more administrative things. It made sense. Her Spanish was better. She understood the systems. She handled calls, forms, appointments. I signed where she told me to sign. It didn't feel like giving up control. It felt like delegating to someone who cared. My world continued to narrow, but it did so quietly. Fewer outside conversations, fewer independent decisions. Not because she forbade them, because they seemed unnecessary. She was my point of reference now. One evening, she told me she might be pregnant. She didn't announce it. She whispered it, like a confession. Her hands shook when she said it. She was scared. Her parents would be ashamed, she said. The community would judge her. Everything would unravel. I felt a rush of emotions that didn't line up neatly. Shock, fear, responsibility, a strange, unexpected tenderness. At my age, the idea of fatherhood again wasn't something I'd imagined. But the idea of abandoning someone in that moment felt unthinkable. I told her we'd handle it. Together. That we were married. That whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. She cried then, relief, not panic. In the weeks that followed, she leaned into the role of wife with renewed intensity. Caring, protective, affectionate. She talked about the future in warmer terms. A family. A business someday. Something to leave behind. I started planning too, quietly, making sure there was enough. Adjusting expectations. Reframing what retirement meant. I noticed my energy slipping during this time. Mornings were harder. I tired more easily. But I attributed it to stress, age, the heat. She encouraged me to rest, gave me the supplements, told me I'd feel better soon. I wanted to believe that. The pregnancy didn't last. or so I was told. There was a hospital visit, panic, waiting rooms, a doctor speaking softly. She cried. I held her. I believed we were mourning something together. Afterward, she was fragile, needed care, needed reassurance. I stepped into that role without hesitation. If marriage had felt like a solution before, now it felt like an obligation, not imposed, but internal. I had promised to take care of her, of us. That promise became the lens through which every decision passed. When she suggested investing some money into a small venture with someone she trusted, a relative, a friend, it sounded reasonable, a way to build something, a way to ensure stability. I hesitated. I asked questions. She answered them patiently, framed it as a shared future, not a risk. I agreed. Looking back, I can see how many of my decisions during that period were driven by the same impulse: keep things from breaking. I wasn't chasing more happiness. I was protecting what I already had. And that's how commitment stopped being a choice and became a mechanism, a structure that made backing out feel cruel, irresponsible, even immoral. By the time doubts began to surface, about money, about my health, about the pace of everything, they were buried under layers of responsibility I'd willingly taken on. Marriage hadn't changed who she was overnight. It had changed what I felt allowed to question. I told myself that every relationship goes through adjustments, that uncertainty was normal, that love required endurance. I told myself that if I stayed steady, everything would settle. What I didn't understand yet was that steadiness can look a lot like surrender when the ground beneath you is slowly shifting. The first thing I noticed wasn't the money. It was my body. I started waking up tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Not sore, heavy, like my limbs were filled with wet sand. Some mornings my heart felt like it was working harder than it should, beating faster even when I was standing still. I told myself it was age, or stress, or the heat. She told me the same. You're not used to this climate yet, you worry too much. You need to rest more. She said it gently, brushing my hair back, touching my arm, as if reassurance itself could regulate a pulse. The supplements became routine. She handed them to me with breakfast, watched to make sure I took them, smiled when I did. I trusted her attention because it looked like care, because no one had paid that much attention to me in years. When I mentioned seeing a doctor, she discouraged it without forbidding it. Doctors made things complicated. They overtested. They scared people unnecessarily. She knew what worked. People in her family had used these things for years. I didn't want to argue. Arguing would have meant admitting doubt, and doubt would have cracked the calm we built everything on. Around this time, the money started moving faster, not recklessly, just steadily. Family needs, business expenses, unexpected repairs. She always explained where it was going, and each explanation made sense on its own. When I added them up in my head, it felt uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't proof, it's just a feeling. And feelings, I told myself, aren't facts. The small business investment she'd suggested never quite produced results. There were delays, paperwork issues, market problems. She relayed updates from the person managing it, summaries, never details. When I asked to see accounts, she said it would only confuse me, that these things work differently here, that I should trust the process. Trust had become my default response. Meanwhile, my world continued to contract. I stopped going to the expat meetups altogether. Not because she asked me to, because it felt easier not to explain my life to people who might ask questions I didn't want to answer. She didn't like those gatherings anyway. Too many women. Too many opinions. Why do you need them? She'd ask, half joking. You have me. I laughed along. But part of me noticed the question underneath the joke. My phone calls home grew shorter. I didn't tell my kids much. I didn't want to worry them. I didn't want to explain a situation. I was still trying to understand myself. Shame has a way of isolating you before you even know you're ashamed. There were moments, small, sharp ones, when clarity almost broke through. Like the time I caught her texting late at night, turning her phone away when I walked into the room. Or the time I overheard her lowering her voice during a call, switching languages mid-sentence. Or the way she became defensive when I suggested handling certain things myself again. Nothing that could stand alone as proof. Everything that could be explained. That's the trap. When every concern has a reasonable answer, you start distrusting your instincts instead of the situation. My health worsened. The dizziness came more often. Short walks left me winded. One night, my heart raced so hard I had to sit on the edge of the bed until it slowed. She held my hand and told me to breathe. Told me it was anxiety. Told me she'd take care of me. Her care felt constant now. Almost total. She managed my schedule, my meals, my medications, my money, my interactions. I told myself that was marriage. That was partnership. But partnership assumes agency on both sides. What I felt was dependence. The first real crack came quietly. She went out one afternoon to visit family, or so she said. I stayed home, exhausted, scrolling idly on my phone. Her phone buzzed on the table beside me. I didn't mean to look. I wasn't suspicious, just bored. The message preview was enough. A name I recognized, a tone I didn't. Something in my chest tightened. Not panic, recognition. That small, cold certainty that arrives before your mind catches up. I didn't open the message. I didn't confront her when she came home smiling, carrying groceries, asking how I felt. I told myself it was nothing. That night, lying awake beside her, listening to her breathe, I felt the weight of all the things I hadn't wanted to see. Not proof, patterns. The kind that only make sense once you stop defending them. The next morning, she handed me the supplements as usual. I took them, or pretended to. Later, when she was in the shower, I flushed them down the toilet. Within days, I felt different, not cured, but clearer. Less fog, less pressure in my chest. That scared me more than the symptoms had. I went to a private clinic on my own. Didn't tell her. I explained the fatigue, the dizziness, the supplements. The doctor listened carefully, asked questions she never had. He told me the supplements weren't inherently dangerous, but not appropriate for someone my age, taken daily, without supervision. They strained the heart, affected blood pressure. Explained a lot of what I'd been feeling. He asked who'd given them to me. I didn't answer right away. Walking home, the city felt sharper, louder, like I'd been underwater and suddenly surfaced. I stopped taking anything she gave me after that, quietly, carefully. At the same time, I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before, watching her movements, her explanations, her reactions when I asked neutral questions. I followed her one evening when she said she was meeting a friend. I stayed far enough back not to be noticed. I watched her sit across from the same man who'd been managing the business. Watched the way they leaned toward each other, the way familiarity moved between them without effort. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. The truth didn't arrive as devastation. It arrived as relief. Relief that my unease had a shape. Relief that I wasn't imagining it. Relief that the confusion could finally settle into something solid. What followed was not rage. It was paralysis. Because once you see the structure you're inside, you also see how hard it is to leave it. My money was tied up. My residency depended on the marriage. My health was fragile. My pride was exhausted. I didn't know how to confront her without collapsing everything at once, including myself. That night, she came home cheerful, kissed my cheek, asked if I'd taken my supplements. I nodded. Lying beside her later, staring at the ceiling, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't afraid of losing her. I was afraid of what it would cost to get my life back. And that fear, quiet, rational, humiliating, was the clearest sign yet of how far control had already shifted. I didn't leave dramatically. There was no confrontation where the truth spilled out in a rush. No shouting, no packed bags thrown across the room, no moment where she confessed or I demanded answers. What I did instead was slow things down. That was the only move left to me. I stopped agreeing to new plans. When she talked about expanding the business, or sending more money, or helping someone else just this once, I said I needed time to think. I stopped explaining myself. Explanations had always been the opening she needed to guide me back where she wanted me. I watched her react to that change with confusion at first, then irritation. Not anger, impatience. Like something she relied on had stopped responding the way it used to. I also started protecting what little independence I still had. I separated accounts where I could. I stopped signing things without reading them. I scheduled my own appointments. I went back to the clinic and focused on getting my strength back quietly, deliberately. I didn't tell her I knew. Knowing felt like something I had to keep intact until I was stable enough to act on it. The strange thing is, once I stopped playing my role the way she expected, the affection changed. It didn't disappear. It sharpened, became more urgent, more physical, more insistent. She needed reassurance now. I saw then how much of our connection had been transactional without either of us naming it that way. I provided stability. She provided closeness. When one wavered, the other intensified. I began sleeping poorly, not from fear, but from clarity. It's hard to rest once you see the mechanics of your own life laid bare. I spoke to a lawyer. Not dramatically, just to understand what leaving would actually mean. The answers weren't comforting. Untangling a marriage across borders is slow, expensive, emotionally grinding. There were no clean exits, only degrees of loss. I realized I wasn't choosing between staying and leaving. I was choosing between losses. That realization stripped away the last of my illusions. I wasn't waiting for justice or fairness. I was calculating survival. I told her I needed to return to the US for a while. Health reasons, family obligations. I framed it as temporary because anything permanent would have triggered resistance I didn't have the energy to manage. She didn't like it. She tried to talk me out of it. Told me she'd take care of me better here. The doctors there didn't understand me the way she did. I smiled and nodded and didn't argue. I left with one suitcase, not because I couldn't carry more, because I didn't want to explain why I was taking it. At the airport, I didn't feel heartbreak. I felt something closer to embarrassment. Not public humiliation, private reckoning, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. Back in the US, everything felt smaller and louder at the same time. I stayed with family. I went through medical follow-ups. I rested in a way I hadn't allowed myself to rest before. As my health stabilized, something else did too, my memory. I stopped replaying conversations and started replaying decisions. Not what she said, but what I agreed to. Where I stepped aside. Where I mistook calm for safety and consistency for loyalty. I didn't demonize her. That surprised people when I talked about it later. They wanted a villain, someone to blame. A story that ended with moral clarity. But clarity doesn't always come packaged that way. She was younger, under pressure, navigating her own fears and incentives in a system that rewarded access to stability. She made choices that protected her future at the expense of mine. I made choices too. I confused being needed with being known. I handed over structure, money, paperwork, health decisions, before trust had earned that role. I let loneliness dress itself up as responsibility. Mexico wasn't the problem. The systems weren't the problem. Even the relationship, in isolation, wasn't some unbelievable outlier. The problem was sequencing. I gave permanence to something that hadn't been tested by time or strain. I let routine masquerade as reliability. I believed that because nothing was wrong, nothing could go wrong. That's not how life works. Especially not when you cross borders carrying more hope than leverage. I didn't lose everything. That matters. I lost money. I lost years I won't get back. I lost the illusion of a certain kind of ending. But I didn't lose myself completely, though I came closer than I like to admit. What I lost first, long before anything else, was stability. And stability, once gone, takes far more effort to rebuild than affection ever did. I don't regret going to Mexico. That still surprises me. I regret the order in which I trusted. I regret mistaking silence for peace. I regret assuming that because something felt gentle, it was safe. If there's anything I carry forward now, it's this. Trust isn't an emotion. It's a structure. And structures need foundations before you start living inside them. I don't warn people away from love, or Mexico, or starting over. I warn them away from skipping steps. Because when things fall apart slowly, without drama, without villains, without a single moment you can point to and say, there, you don't realize what you've lost until the scaffolding is already gone. And rebuilding after that isn't tragic. It's just quiet and lonely and honest in a way I wasn't ready for before. That's the part no one tells you about starting over. Not that it can fail, but that it can fail gently and still take almost everything with it.